communism, it can keep changing. It's like magic tricks, sleight of hand. It's like, so Marx talks about, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, and the workers will seize the means of production. Mao talks about the peasants and the landlords. Today American Marxists will talk about, frame it as racial dynamics in the United States. So everything keeps changing. How would you define this Marxism, communism to somebody that like makes it identifiable?
Yeah, I would define it as basically an anti-human ideology. And of course, ideology in the Western sense is kind of a form of ideas that motivate government. But in the Chinese context, it's actually regarded as kind of a consciousness. So it's infused the ruling party, which is now boasting, I think, 98 million members. Again, this is not the whole country. I mean, the average Chinese, they're not interested in the ideology. They'd rather live a prosperous, free life. But the party sees itself, and especially now under Xi Jinping, they've revitalized Marxism-Leninism and they're dropping their bide our time and hide our capabilities strategy. And they're openly declaring. In fact, the most recent episode of the podcast, I went to the website of the Central Party School, which is now publishing online its ideological journal called Chu Xi. And in this, they list, they had an article on Chinese diplomacy, and they listed a number of things. But the key thing that has changed for them is they're starting to talk about how Chinese ideology is not just for the Chinese people, it's for all mankind, all humankind. And so they're beginning to demonstrate that they are on the march, and that China must reclaim its place as the middle kingdom under heaven, that they are the dominant nation. And again, they're struggling against the capitalist world that they think is unfairly treating China and the Chinese people. They try to conflate or conjoin the idea of the party and the people. And that was one of the most important policy changes that was made during the Trump administration, where the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, began to distinguish between the Chinese people and the ruling Chinese Communist Party that ruled over the Chinese people. That was one of the most opposed positions during the Trump administration. And Pompeo told me when I interviewed him a couple of times, he said, when the Chinese were coming to him to complain about things, that was at the top of their list, that they really disliked this idea that they weren't that the Chinese people and the Chinese party were not one and the same. And I remember that too. A number of years ago at the Washington Times, where I worked, a PLA colonel came to visit me. He was visiting some think tank, and he came to me, and I explained to him, I said, look, my position in reporting is that I'm not against the Chinese people. I'm against the Chinese Communist Party. And he vehemently objected to that. He said, no, you are anti-Chinese people. So that is one method that they use to try to discredit their critics and opponents.
I do think that in the West, in America, we don't really understand how pervasive the ideology is, like the Marxist-Leninist ideology in China. I think because there's not something comparable in the U.S. I mean, when you, like, in elementary school in China, like one of the first songs you learn to sing is, without the Chinese Communist Party, there would be no new China, right? Like, it is embedded in the education. Like, you have to take Marxist-Leninist like theory classes, starting in elementary school. You have to pass that section of the college entrance exam to be able to get into college. And I think it's easy for us to just be like, okay, well, sure, they say they're Marxist-Leninists. Like, there's all this kind of fuddy-duddy like language, ideological language in their documents, but does that really mean anything? Does that actually translate into the actions of the CCP.
Yes, absolutely. This is, and it's very similar to what took place at the start of the Cold War when we had the famous X article, which called The Sources of Soviet Conduct, which basically said that what the Soviets were doing was based on their ideology. A similar occurrence is now. We're seeing the sources of Chinese conduct are its ideology. It's not divorced from that. And yet, we in the West don't come from the same ideological culture. We have an innate sense that people tell us the truth all the time. And so it's very difficult, I think, for Americans to comprehend this. And the other problem is, again, it goes back to the China card during the Cold War, where the U.S. was engaged in a difficult regional war in Vietnam, and we were able to reach out to the Chinese Communist regime, which again was struggling to survive basically in the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution. And the Chinese and the U.S. were able to cooperate. We even had an intelligence base inside of China which monitored Soviet missile fields in the eastern part of the Soviet Union. But then what happened was, after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, this pro-China policy through people like Kissinger and others who believed that, who decided that we were going to ignore Chinese ideology and its crimes against humanity and its activities in order to have personal relations. So personal relations between US and Chinese leaders became a dominant feature of our China policy for great disaster, in my view. And so this policy kind of went on and again. And I remember the thing that kind of got me going on this back in the late 90s. I went to the Defense Intelligence Agency for a briefing on the Chinese military. Back then, they used to give reporters background briefings. And I went for this briefing on the PLA, and it was fairly vanilla. And at the end of the briefing, a colonel came in and said, "The general would like to see you." And okay. The general was the director of the DIA. And we sat in a windowless conference room. And the director of the DIA said to me, he said, "Bill, China is not a threat." And I said, "Well, what's the basis for your conclusion of that?" And I'm paraphrasing it, but he basically said, "Because they told us they're not a threat." And I mean, obviously, he was trying to spin me as a reporter, but the fact of the matter is that China has gone to great lengths to deceive the United States and the West. And they've done that through this personality-driven policy where they had people come and try to make relations with the leadership and ignore the ideology and its consequences. So we changed that during the Trump administration when China became first a strategic competitor. Now it's still a strategic competitor, but we need to understand that it is an ideological adversary, an enemy, and it wants to destroy the United States. The sole impediment for Beijing to achieve the China dream under Xi Jinping's reckoning, and that's based on a PLA colonel named Liu Mingfu, who wrote the book, The China Dream. The main impediment to China achieving its dream is the United States. Again, and the reason is that the United States is the leader of world capitalism that must be defeated.